Hi everyone, here's the Book Chemist once again, and I usually do not talk about criticism, texts or academic books on this channel, but this is a classic, The Anxiety of Influence by Harold Bloom, the one kind of non-fiction book that's good for you, the kind that helps you with the fiction you are reading. Recipe books are also acceptable occasionally. Now, The Anxiety of Influence is not about fiction at all, actually, not if you mean prose fiction by that, it's about mostly poetry. But what it really does is provide a theory of poetry, a theory of literature, one might say, that relies heavily on the idea of influence, and it explains the idea of influence as a form of anxiety. The title says that, felt by all authors toward their idols, very much their heroes, their literary heroes. And it is a book, being a classic book of criticism, that falls into all three of the traps all good book of criticism fall into, which is number one, that at certain points the author just stops giving any fuck and starts talking about whatever the fuck he wants, even if it does not have anything really specifically to do with the topic of the text. This does happen here specifically in the preface, which you'll only get actually if you have the second edition of the book, in which Bloom makes some changes to his theory in regards to the figure of Shakespeare, more on that in a second, and also shoots a few very well aimed arrows at what he famously calls the school of resentment, those readers who read literary texts to impose political or social folds and meanings onto them. And Bloom believes, and I largely share his view on the topic, that literature is an aesthetic achievement, and that's the reason why we should read, because of that, and not in order to find any kind of political fault or in order to make any kind of political or social point in the books we're reading. That is kind of besides the point of the enterprise of reading. And there were certain moments in the introduction, Bloom, like all best critics, can be quite dicky. There were some moments in which I was reading and I really went like, bravo, bravo. The other two pitfalls of the good criticism text you'll find in here is that, well, number two, at times the book is way harder and way more complicated to read than the actual complex poetry it criticizes, because of course, number three, in order to fully understand The Anxiety of Influence, you kinda need to have read pretty much all of the texts Harold Bloom has read in his life, and Harold Bloom is kind of fucking Harold Bloom. He has read pretty much everything, especially in the topics he deals with. Romantic poetry, modernist, postmodernist poetry, Renaissance poetry, literature in general. It's not that Bloom himself is a dick, even though of course he is at time, he is a literary critic, it's kind of his job. It's that he wrote in a world in which the idea of canon, the idea of established literary standards were still, as I said, established, and so it was kind of expected when you approached a book like this that you had read and you knew all of the poetry, of the canonical poetry he talks about. Nowadays that is not the case any longer, and there's lots of people, most people I think with English, with a literature degree, who are not going to know much about many of the poets he talks about. I have like 2 literature degrees and I didn't get many of these references, but I still do think that you can get a lot out of texts like this if you only read dedicatedly enough. The idea of The Anxiety of Influence, as I have already introduced it, is very kind of self-explanatory, even though the details of this process of influence are complicated and well detailed in the book and all have these very cryptic kind of Greek names, but whatever. But the general idea is that authors, writers and poets in general, do experience the anxiety of, well, the fact that they can't be original, because all that's worth saying has already been said by their masters. So throughout their production they kind of struggle with their masters. In this way they vent their violent feelings and eventually they kind of symbolically kill their masters, which, as you might probably imagine, is a very male-oriented kind of theory. All of these poets are males, and for that very understandable reason, it's not a theory that is going to fly too well with many readers, and it feels kind of outdated up to a certain point in today's world. But as I said before, there are some things that any reader can get from this book, and I in particular got 2 points that I like very much, that I like to think about, and I'd like to share with you. The first point is that Bloom gives you in the 6th chapter of this book, when he describes the final outcome of this anxiety of influence, a very good model, I think, to distinguish between somebody who is heavily influenced by another artist but overcomes this influence, and someone who is a simpler kind of like influence artist, simpler kind of imitator, we might say. The idea that Bloom proposes, to simplify things a lot, is that of course all great writers and artists sublimate in their production and present the same ideas, the same concepts that were there in their idols and their masters and the people they loved. Except that truly genius writers and artists sublimate their masters so much that at a certain point it almost seems, absurdly enough, that the masters themselves are influenced by their pupils. That is a theory that is very easily understood if you think about music, that you get it immediately if you think about that. When I personally listen to much 50s rock and roll, very early classic rock and roll, what I hear in that, like kind of paradoxically, is the first seeds and the first elements of the Beatles, of British invasion, even though that came, of course, later. When you listen to, for instance, some kind of a very theatrical British record like The Cure, like Disintegration, stuff like that, you already hear in that what will later become Arcade Fire, and that kind of 21st century, very bombastic, majestic kind of indie rock and roll. Other lesser artists and creators do sublimate the ideas and the influence of their masters, but the masters remain the key figure. When you listen to a record such as Hot Fuzz by The Killers, which is heavily influenced by New Order and by all those alternative and synth pop bands from the British 80s, you do hear New Order in that, but New Order remains the key figure, the influencer. You wouldn't say that like The Killers reinvented the British 80s or like innovated on New Order, not so much. And that, by the way, has nothing to do with matters of quality or of taste, if you ask me. And I, for instance, listens to Hot Fuzz way more often and with way more pleasure than Arcade Fire, for instance. Moving to the world of literature, one of the reasons, in my opinion, that make H.P. Lovecraft such a massive and such a seminal writer and such an important and great writer is that when you read contemporary horror, so many writers summon H.P. Lovecraft and summon his influence, but only a very, very few, almost no one manages to make H.P. Lovecraft look like some kind of shy imitator of them. Almost all of them have to bow to the motherfucking master, as much as lots of people nowadays like to joke on how, yeah, it was a terrible wordsmith, har har har, fuck you all. The only people who manage to do that, to kind of make H.P. Lovecraft look like a pussy, are like Stephen King's at his best, someplace in It and Salem Slot, and Joyce Carol Oates in kind of lots of places. The other idea I got from the anxiety of influence, which I liked a lot, is that Bloom believes that the anxiety of influence is very much a historical phenomenon. He like puts its beginning with more or less the Romantic movement, and it continues worse and worse throughout the 19th century and with modernism and postmodernism. In the preface, he admits that some kind of anxiety of influence is already at play with Shakespeare and his his idol or rival Christopher Marlowe. But at the same time, he believes that, for instance, in the medieval world, in medieval literature, there's not that kind of anxiety. And if you take, for instance, Dante, he has a clear master and a clear idol in Virgil, his model, but at the same time in the Divine Comedy you don't get that anxiety. Of course, the issue is not so simple, but you don't get that feeling of struggle, of violent struggle. And of course, anyone who's read the Divine Comedy will agree that the two of them are anything but rivals or enemies in the Divine Comedy. That is interesting to me because I do believe that we might have reached a stage in literature in which that condition of peacefulness is again possible. And I'm thinking about several essays on the topic of influence that elevate influence to some kind of bliss and consider it like a blessing much more than a curse or something that needs to be fought violently. I'm thinking about The Ecstasy of Influence by Jonathan Lethem and Fun Fictions by Michael Chabon, most notably. But like again, much more simple. Think about the world of music. If in 2015 you were living on Earth, you probably know about To Pimp a Butterfly by Kendrick Lamar, and that record is the sublimation of the relationship between Kendrick and Tupac, his mentor, his idol, let's say his hero, but you don't feel there's any anxiety of influence in there. If anything, you feel like there's a relationship that is almost between equals, between this master and this pupil. All of these are ideas I got from the book I'd really like to reflect upon. Mr. Bloom would probably throw at me a copy of his book if he heard me talking like this. But yeah, I thought this was the kind of read that really sets your synapses on fire. I'm not saying it's flawless, I'm not saying it's not outdated. I think you should consider reading this thing. Either read it like me and get a few key ideas out of it, or spend like 3 to 4 years of your life getting yourself an actual culture and do read this thing by getting every single line in it. Your choice. Let me know what you think about The Anxiety of Influence and about Harold Bloom in general as a critic, if you agree with his view on literature and the world in general, or if you're not. If you don't, thank you so much for watching once again, guys. Bye, guys.